August 14th meeting of the Utility Finance Oversight Committee started. With that, can we do a roll call, Kathy?
Chairperson Bennett.
Here.
Vice Chairperson Bowling, Member Johnston, Member Maples.
Here.
Here.
Thank you. At this time, we'll open up the meeting to public comment. The public is invited at this time to comment on and discuss any topic that is relevant to or within the authority of the Utility Finance Oversight Committee, including any matter that is not specifically included on the agenda as an action item. No action may be taken on a matter raised under public comment unless the item has been specifically included on the agenda as an item upon which action may be taken. At this time, seeing that there is no public comment, I will close public comment, and I will move on to action item number 1, which is approval of the meeting minutes. Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes? And if so, if there's no comments, I'd like to open it up for a motion.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the minutes are nice and concise. I would move for approval as presented.
Member Scott moves for approval. Do I have a second?
I'll second the motion.
Member Maples provides a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 And chair votes aye for the record. With that, we'll move on to item 2A, which is information only, and it's presentation and discussion of manager and consultant's report on the rate study progress. Darren, you're going to start that one out, and I wanted to just point out before you get started, Darren, that this is an information only item, but certainly the committee is open and welcome to provide any opinions that you guys have. So with that, we'll go ahead.
Yeah, I'll start us off here. Andy Hummel, wastewater utility manager for Carson City. We've got Brent and Alexa here from Far West today to give us a presentation on their progress on the water, wastewater, and stormwater rate study refresh. The bulk of this will be on the stormwater. There's been a lot of back and forth and work behind the scenes on methodologies. There's some inequities in that rate structure that we see that different ways to correct that, some with much more impact to the current rate structure than others. So they've prepared some examples on each of those methodologies and kind of what we would see a change to kind of give us some bookends on what that would look like. And then Alexa's been working really hard on the current rate model that we use that FCS prepared 5 years ago on the water and wastewater side of it to help us out on that. So she's going to update on kind of where we're at in that progress. So with that, Kathy, if we could get this up on the TV, I got it loaded here.
Apologize, I just realized that the AV's not fired up yet.
There it is.
There we go.
Well, good morning. I'm Brent Farr with Far West Engineering, and I can't believe that this room isn't just packed full of people that are interested in hearing about this at 8 o'clock in the morning. Just as a kind of an update on the water and wastewater, because it won't be part of the presentation today, I met with Alexa yesterday and we reviewed the model. As you recall, we're using the existing model that FCS built about 5 years ago, and just simply trying to update that with new information. And we're very close. We reviewed it yesterday. There's still just a couple little things that need some attention, and I think at the next meeting, we'll be ready to present the preliminary results of that update. So today, the focus on stormwater. So Andy, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the existing rate structure as it stands today, and I thought it might be nice to just kind of review how we got here. Back in 2001, there was a study, a pretty in-depth study prepared by Hector Sire from Water Resource Associates. They did a in-depth study on stormwater, and their recommendation in the end was to do something based on the impervious area. And that was presented to the various political constituents, and then at the very last minute, it morphed into this, which we did some research. We don't exactly have a full accounting of how we got to this. I think that I have some ideas. The study that was done by Water Resource Associates indicated that the typical range for a residential property at the time was between like $3 and $5 a month. So I think what they did is they set that and then counted the number of properties and came up with a revenue, and then determined that the balance of the properties had to cover the balance of the revenue requirement. And so they kind of just took the number of other types of properties and divided that in and came up with a rate. Now, the only thing I'm not really sure on is why the difference between the various non-residential properties. There's just slight nuances there. I mean, between multifamily and public, I don't know how that came about. We can't find the record for that. But that's generally how that was developed, and it diverted away from the study and away from the impervious area recommendation, and that's what we have today. So the challenge with that study is just simply that there are some inequities in it, and we'll show some of those here in a second, and also somewhat difficult to explain how we got there, which is always a problem if you can't define the basis. So Andy, let's look at a couple of these properties and talk about some of the inequities. And I kind of focused on multifamily, and then a category called residential office, and then even large commercial. But we'll show a variety here and kind of get an idea. So this first one, what's being outlined is the property on the top in red. This is Vivian Gonzalez. It's a multifamily property with 3 units and 6,700 square foot of impervious area. So you can see a lot of vegetation there, not much pavement, so a small percentage of impervious area. So let's compare that to the Cottonwood Mobile Home Park with 89 units in it and 233,000 square foot of impervious area. So those two properties pay the same monthly bill, and you can see quite a difference by, you divide 7,000 into 233. I mean, the magnitude is quite different. So that's just one example of kind of an inequity in multifamily. And by the way, on multifamily, important to note that at first I was kind of wondering if the $29 was per unit, but it's actually for the entire property. So the whole property pays $29. So just another one here, 176 unit apartment complex with, again, about 230,000 square feet of impervious area, also pays $29.33 a month.
If I may, and I don't mean to derail your thought, are all multifamily properties in Carson City metered off of a single meter, and that's why they're all charged that single rate, or does it depend on how the meter or the service is billed?
For the stormwater side,
Yeah.
some of them are split by the unit, I believe, from their water meter, but for the purpose of the stormwater billing, they're a flat rate by the property.
But the stormwater is a separate bill that goes to the individual property owner perhaps, so it is for sure only
Yeah,
by
it's
the
for that
parcel,
whole
not.
property complex.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, thank you.
It's a great question. All right, here's a commercial property. This is zoned downtown mixed use. This is in like a little kind of a strip property, strip mall kind of thing. And you've got this tiny little property with 2,700 square foot of impervious area, is basically the rooftop. And let's go to the next one. So commercial pays $40.96. So here's another interesting category. This is Andrew Fromdahl, who has a property zoned residential office. And his property's a little over 11,000 square feet. Now, he actually called me, and he's someone who's kind of voiced some opinion about these rates and kind of some of the inequities. And so he doesn't run a business out of his home. But it is zoned for residential office. And so as a result, instead of paying the residential rate of about $6, he's paying the commercial rate of, almost $41. And so let's go, just kind of showing you a variety of what's in commercial. And then, of course, the big guys, here's Walmart, zoned light industrial. huge property, huge impervious area, almost 800,000 square feet. So let's go back and back again. So this guy and then the next one and then Walmart all pay the same amount. And so Andrew's point is like, well, first of all, I don't even run a business out of my home, and I've got 11,000 square foot of impervious area and I pay the same as Walmart. So pretty easy to see how there's quite a range here in the commercial properties. Let's go to the next. Okay, so here's a public property. Here's Carson City School District. They pay as a public property $32 roughly. And this is one of the largest parcels at 1.3 million square feet of impervious area. So quite a variety there. So here's a table. The next slide is a table, and a little hard to see. I apologize for that. But what I did here is I took just a cross section of different types of properties just to give an example of the variety and some of the inequities that exist. And I sorted this one based on the impervious area of the parcel and compared that to the current bill. And so what I did is I as a way of estimating what a bill would look like based on impervious area, I rounded some numbers here. The current budget is a little less than 2 million, but the proposed budget will be more than that. So I just took a $2 million budget and divided by about 200 million square foot of impervious area. And the way we got that was that study done in 2001 or 2, actually they went in and painstakingly determined how much impervious area there was at the time. And we just took that times kind of a nominal growth rate for the community and got to close to 200 million square feet. So this is not a perfect analysis, but it's close, and it kind of shows you how this would work out. So it comes out to be about a penny per square foot per year in terms of impervious area. And so you apply that by the impervious area, and you can kind of see how it shakes out. You see that Eugene Cheney, who had that really small commercial property, well, he would only get, charged a little over $2 a month compared to being charged $40 currently. So his bill would go down by almost $39. And so you can see how that kind of plays out down the line to the high end, where you look at that Carson School District, they pay $32. But if they paid based on impervious area, their bill would be over $1,000 a month. So it's the most, probably the closest to complete equity that you could get, but may not be palatable. I think that this was the reason why at the last minute, the recommendations back in 2002 were not adopted. I think just some concern about some of those properties paying, $600,000 or $700 a month was just too much. So let me just pause there. Any questions about this impervious area concept and this analysis here, the rates?
One kind of related general question. Do public facilities all pay an assessment on this, including city facilities? Given the city's penchant for getting into other budgets, do water, for example, pay anything, or others?
The city buildings do not pay a fee, a stormwater fee.
And state, do we have any?
State
Okay.
does, school district does,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Okay.
Brent, I'm curious how that impervious area is calculated. I know in the slide presentation later, you do the pros and the cons, and you mentioned it's obviously very tedious.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, what is that process?
Yeah, Andy, if you want to go back to one of the slides, just as an example, any of them's fine. So here's the school, and it's not a perfect science, but our GIS staff would take an image like this and basically trace over all of the paved areas and then the rooftop. And off to the right there, is that a solar field? Yeah, so they kind of went over some of that. So it's not, it's not an exact science, but it's pretty close. So you're just looking at those areas that create runoff and avoiding the earth areas and grassed and landscaped areas. So it takes quite a bit of effort to do that.
And so theoretically, if we were to pursue this methodology, you would have to go through that process for every property in the city?
Yeah, that makes it, that's correct. With the exception of there's a method to deal with residential properties and reduce the workload quite a bit. I think what the previous study recommended, and it's actually from literature, I can tell it's quite common, is you would take like an average residential impervious area. So you might take a cross-section of 100 or something and find out that the study that was previously done found out that the average for residential properties was like 3,600 square feet. And you just kind of set that and call it good. And then you're looking at all the non-residential properties, which, is still, I think I have the number of those. I mean, you're still looking at, well, I mean, the non-residential properties is approaching about 2,000. So you'd have to do that for that many properties.
Thanks.
And then you would have to keep up the database as well, because there's changes to those properties. So you'd have to institute a program to be able to monitor it and make changes to it as there's improvements made to them.
Yeah, so it's a pretty intensive approach. But I will say that, again, from literature research, about 85% of the kind of shut off there. 85% of the communities that have a stormwater rate use an impervious area method. So it's pretty popular or common, I guess I should say. But it is time intensive. So Andy, let's move on to, I think we're on the pros and cons. Yeah, so if you're looking strictly for, hey, everybody's going to pay based on what they're contributing, based on impervious area, this is probably the most equitable structure. But I think that the community did find last time that it was a little difficult to implement because of the impact on some of the larger commercial properties. And then the difficulty in administering this over time is pretty complicated and time consuming. Okay, let's take a look at another approach. And these are just sort of kind of hybrids to try to simplify things a little bit. And one way of doing that, the idea behind this sort of grouped method would be to reduce the impact on some of the very largest properties. And so by grouping them together, some in a category might pay more than they would if it was strictly an impervious area, and some would pay less. But it comes out to an average that would be still higher than it is today, and it would create at least a little more equity here. So as an example, you could say you're going to have your single family rate, I've rounded that to $6, and then you'd have this small property, medium, large, and very large. And this is just a different one. Okay, is that okay? So this would, you'd kind of have to define what small and medium are. And this analysis is not complete, but it's just a concept. And so to see how that would play out, Andy, let's look at the next slide. Still a lot going on here, but look at that first one, that Eugene Cheney again. His property is only, because it's just part of a mall, so to speak, or a commercial development, it's like 0.06 acres. It's really small. So that would be classified as a small parcel, non-residential parcel. At $20, it would still be a break over what is currently paid by almost half, but quite a bit more than what it would be if it was based on an impervious area. But these averaging, so some people would pay a little more than maybe they would, and some would pay less. but it still creates some equity in that, like on a small parcel, they're gonna be paying less than they currently do. And you go down to the Walmarts and the school districts and some of those really large commercial properties, they're gonna pay $160 a month versus 40. And so it's a bump, but it's still palatable for some of the really big ones. Now, of course, these numbers are not, I don't want you to think that that's how these are gonna turn out exactly. I did highlight this Andrew Fromdahl, because I think at the end of this, at some point, this board and the city council are gonna have to decide, should someone like that just simply be considered a residential property? He's got neighbors, for example, that are right next to him that are not residential office, they're just residential, kind of a larger, maybe rural parcel, but they're just paying the $6, so I don't know. Please.
First of all, I guess a question, Brent. In your alternative method, have you run the numbers to see if that generates a $2 million budget goal? Or is that just, at this point, a preliminary potential allocation?
It's the latter.
Okay.
Each of these would take quite a bit of analysis to complete, and so I'm kind of hoping that after today, we have some direction on which one to kind of look at in more detail, and then I can do more analysis. So, yeah, those numbers are likely to change in some way.
And then one comment specifically about the residential office. I happen to be involved in our business, which is a residential office. Frankly, with parking requirements, we generate more runoff than we would as a resident. So I don't, I've always felt that we were hit pretty hard compared with others, but it seems to me that if you probably only have a handful of residential office zoned properties that don't have some sort of a business license attached to them that makes them in effect an office. And so, Mr. Fromdahl may be the exception, but I don't personally feel it's fair to have residential offices get by on the same basis as a residence, because I think you have different considerations, and I think there should be some sort of a recognition that there potentially is a greater runoff from an office, even though it's in a residential area. So just for what it's worth, that would be my 2 cents. And it might be as straightforward as the residential office gets a separate rate, and if somebody claims they're not running an office there, as long as there's no business license, maybe they go down to the residential rate. I can't imagine there's more than a handful of those, and administratively, it's a bit of a hurdle, but to me, it would be fairer in the big picture.
That's great feedback. I appreciate that. I'm just making a note here. Okay. Any other thoughts on this or questions about what this methodology is saying? Yeah.
Right, can you go back to the previous
Sure.
slide, or Andy? So the groupings, the square footage there, is that just the size of the property, or is that the impervious area?
Okay, that's a great question. So again, this method would be difficult because it is still based on impervious area and not the property size. And so I think it's addressing, the contributions to runoff more than we're currently doing based on the fact that we're looking at impervious area, but that does require, again, that every property be looked at. It's a great question.
And maybe adding to Bruce's comment on Mr. Fromdahl, I assume he's the exception and not the rule. I'm assuming there's very few of those.
Yeah, I think my 10 months here, he's the second that we've had that's inquired about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Handful. So again, I go back and I agree with Bruce's position that, in those types of situations, I think we should allow them to petition for a variance to that, assuming there's no business operating there, and that would be an easy way to deal with that.
It's a great solution. I appreciate that. Okay, well then let's take a look at one more concept here. Oh, so yeah, pros and cons. I guess, Andy, let's just take a quick look here. Still more equitable than the existing structure, kind of groups people together so that those that are on the extremes are kind of grouped in with others to find more common ground in the middle. The cons, maybe a little less, definitely less equitable than the impervious area approach, and also still difficult to administer. Okay, so here's another idea of trying to retain what we currently have, but yet finding a way to create a little more equity within that, and also move away from impervious area and focus more on the size of the parcel, which is not perfect, but definitely much, much easier to manage. So the idea here would be that you would have a bell curve distribution of parcel sizes by small, medium, and large within each of the current customer classes. So within residential, within commercial, industrial, and so on. And you know, and this can be done in different ways. You could have, you could break this into 5 pieces. You could break it into 3. So in this case, you've got basically the middle range would be the medium, and then those on the fringes, maybe a standard deviation or 2 out from the mean would be small and or large. And then you'd have to determine what they would each pay relative to the median. In this case, I kind of said, well, the small ones might pay 25% less and the large ones 50% more, and keeping the same customer classes. So let's go to the next slide. And again, this is all theoretical. It's just concepts. These numbers would have to be really studied more carefully and refined. But so you would look, for example, we would keep a single family customer class, but we would have to determine what the 3 groups would be. Well, what is the medium, and then the large and the small? But you do have some residential parcels that are quite large and have quite a bit of impervious area as a result, versus some very small, like a mobile home or something. And it would create a little bit of equity in that group. And the same for each one. You would do that same analysis and have to determine what those rates would be. So I think this accomplishes a couple things. It does create a little bit more equity, and it also keeps the current structure so that maybe it doesn't confuse people too much, and people are already used to paying certain rates that they, would be. If you were a public property and in that kind of medium range, your rate would be somewhat consistent with what it had been. And and it also accomplishes something that makes this much more easy to manage, and that is it's based on the parcel size and not the impervious area. So it's very quick. That database already exists, obviously. So let's go to the next slide, just as an example of how this could work out. And again, I just kind of picked how these would fall in, just as a way of looking at a what if. But just based on the acreage and the proposed bill, you can kind of see how I've broken that out. So you're still seeing on the small end, people getting a break, but paying more than they would, obviously, if it was based strictly on impervious area. Those in the middle, it's about the same as what they're currently paying. And then those on the larger size paying a bit more. And so, and then at the bottom, you can see the impact even on residential. You'd have some that would get a small break, some that would pay about the same, and some pay quite a bit more. Any questions on this slide or on this methodology in general?
Is there any differentiation in this methodology between developed, undeveloped, or underdeveloped parcels, or it's just simply based on parcel size regardless of its status?
Yeah, right now, that's kind of how it is, and that's the one con with this is that, like a golf course, for example, huge parcel, very little impervious area. So, some of those entities, like golf courses right now, kind of have some of them have asked for a variance and have been classified more like even a residential parcel, because they just have one little building and a small parking area, so they've gotten a break because of that. So another example, we looked at that Vivian Gonzalez property. She was multifamily, 3 pieces on there, but not a lot of impervious area. So she might be classified as kind of a medium-sized parcel, but yet if it was based on impervious area, she'd probably be on the small. So it does create a problem for big parcels that don't have a lot of impervious area. We'd have to figure out some way of addressing that, I guess.
You know, in that vein, generally speaking, I think a larger parcel, commercial, industrial, will have, you know, if it has a larger building, it's got larger parking requirements, and it doesn't deviate too much from somewhat of a proportionate kind of a consideration. I think the golf courses, you know, are the kind of thing that probably should be looked at on their own. I mean, they could claim their receiving area, not a producing area, in some respects too. So that probably would need to be recognized. A question, Brent, on the database.
Yeah.
Am I correct in understanding that the database for the existing parcels at the time of the last study exists, and that there were a number of additional developed areas that would have to be incorporated to get a full commercial, all the new parcels, if you will, new developments since then to have a comprehensive database? Because on the one hand, it's the city's GIS folks can easily take a parcel and calculate, you know, impervious area on a new development. And so it would seem to me, if the database from the previous work was available, that could be updated relatively economically. And in my mind, that's the most defensible and the most understandable concept for people who are being looked at as potential impacts on this.
Yeah, that's a great point. With the data that we've currently received from the city, we haven't been able to find an output that shows specifically the impervious area for every parcel. And so I have to believe that probably exists somewhere, because in the study from 2001, it appears that it was done. So I don't know, we'd have to try to dig deeper to see if we could find it. I don't think we have it.
Yeah, if it's not readily available, it's a big project, I understand.
But it'd have to be, to your point, if you did it once, then the updates and the new parcels would be relatively straightforward for staff to do. We do have in our budget, if the council decides to go this direction, we do have in our budget some money to do some of that impervious area work. And so, but it's kind of set aside if it's needed.
Just from a overall perspective, the understanding you have not gone through the full rate analysis. So these rate structures you're giving us as a sample are not necessarily accurate, because you haven't done the work to figure out what they need to be. From a question I have for you is, I mean, are they in the ballpark? I mean, how are you estimating them? And the reason why I'm asking the question is, if we decide that, hey, there's a method that obviously makes the most sense, as you go through and you actually do the rate analysis, do you see these shifting, you know, substantially, or are they going to be pretty close to the ballpark of what you're presenting?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think some of the variables, for example, would be, you know, this one on the bell curve. You know, I didn't do a bell curve analysis for all the data. It's going to take a little bit of work. So when you do that, it's going to tell you, well, it might not be 10,000 square feet, it might be 8,000 or something like that that constitutes a small parcel. So there's gonna be some nuances like that fall out, but I feel like in general that the numbers, the rates are gonna be somewhat similar to those. They might be off, here or there, but the concept should come out somewhat similar to that.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I just have a couple slides here. So with this method, again, I think it does achieve more equity, with the exception of properties that might have something out of whack with the relative impervious area, like a golf course, for example. But this method is obviously a lot easier to administer and to calculate. We already have the parcel sizes of every parcel. A little bit less equitable than the other two methods. And again, we talked about the issue of properties with low impervious percentages. Next slide, Andy, I think is okay. So those are the concepts, and was hoping through some discussion today we might get some direction on something to pursue a little deeper, to bring back with some more kind of definite results. So
like I said, thank you for that. And like I said at the beginning of this is not an action item, so we're not taking formal action. However, this committee is, being asked for opinion, so, whatever you may have, please let us know.
Well, given that opening, a couple observations just generally. The $2 million budget is really not sufficient to meet the needs for storm drainage. So I think we have to be at least cognizant of that fact. At the same time, if we're thinking that we need to grow the storm drain capability for operations, maintenance, and, prevention, if you will, it needs to be sort of a programmed kind of process, as I would see it. And so one of the things to me that comes out of this is some sort of a progressive phase-in of the process. I think you have to look at your numbers and not make the residential contribution too little. At the same time, I think you have to have the larger parcels given some kind of a process by which the kinds of increases in fees that they might be looking at, moderated or not, nobody can phase those kinds of numbers in overnight. And I'm thinking that a phasing process would be very helpful, and an education process in terms of, I think about the school district, for example. They're just inherently runoff prone with their buildings and parking areas, and at the same time, they have budgets that are tighter than anybody's. So it seems to me that anything we do going forward needs to be looked at in some kind of a phasing in process, but at the same time, a 5-year plan or something like that gives people something to work for or plan for. I think, I wish we were more, we were closer to more of a pure runoff calculation situation. We're not, and politically, we're not going to be able to get there. But I think we do have to, particularly with the larger generators, have to have them understand their contribution relative, for example, to a home, just to put it in perspective for them. Another possibility, do we have any kind of a fee at this point for new construction related to generation of runoff?
No, like a connection fee or an impact fee, I don't believe we do.
I don't know that that's part of the scope of what we're looking at here, but new construction obviously creates an initial impact on the system that wasn't there before.
Bruce, to that point, just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, that concept is out there. There are communities that do that, obviously. So for a new connection, there'd be some kind of an impact, just like there is for water or sewer.
Yeah, it's tough, because if you're a builder and you look at a water connection fee and a sewer connection fee and now potentially a storm drain impact fee, it really adds up. And, the issue of affordable housing, and whether it's apartments or, multifamily or single family, it's a factor. I understand that. But I think we are being hit with things that relate to water quality of runoff and the sorts of regulatory issues that the city becomes responsible for. So those are a few observations at this point in time. I may have some others as we talk, but just some thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with Bruce that, depending on which methodology the city goes with, there could be some pretty significant impacts, and having those come into effect over time, might be the way to go, so it's not all at once. Personally, I think fair and equitable is really what we should be pushing for, and that impervious method does seem to be, in my mind, the most equitable. Could be a tough pill to swallow, obviously, for some people, so I understand that, there's got to be room for some compromise there as well. At this point, that's my thoughts on it.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Bruce. I think both of you make good points. I'll add from my perspective. There's two things that I think are pretty clear from the existing method. It's obvious that the residential side is, from a stormwater perspective, is subsidizing the non-residential parcels. Really, that's what I see. I think whatever we do going forward, Bruce used the term defensible earlier on. While the bell curve approach, easier to implement, pretty straightforward, mathematically to produce whatever that rate structure may be, I don't know if I don't see it being as defensible, especially when you have two parcels, say a Walmart or an undeveloped parcel, and they're going to end up spending or paying the same amount in runoff fees as one another. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I think you have to tip toward the side of doing that impervious calculation. As tedious as it may be, perhaps there's ways that we could minimize the amount of effort, or reduce the amount of effort, such as maybe some sort of equivalent residential unit as you compare it to a commercial site. But again, going back to that term defensible, I think that's really the only way we can do this that is going to make sense to the ratepayers. Now, that said, and going back to my earlier point about the residential has been subsidizing, I think if we get to a situation where everybody is truly paying their fair share, so to speak, then you're going to have higher fees on those larger generators, and that's going to translate to higher costs at either the restaurant or when you buy your car or get your groceries. I mean, we're all going to end up paying it one way or another anyways as citizens. So, I don't know if I'm so concerned about maybe absorbing a little of that in the residential side because it is so spread out. The difference between $5 a month and $5.50 a month is pretty minor when you compare that to a $500 a month bill versus a $1,500 a month bill, especially when you're talking about the politics of trying to get this passed. So, I guess in summary, more equitable, maybe try to reduce some of that subsidy from the residents, but I recognize that the residents are still going to be paying some of that subsidy.
Just second round, excuse me. Has anybody thought about vacant lots not paying anything?
I think that, there's a lot of, as I looked at the current database of customers, there are quite a few little anomalies in there, from when it was put together. So it's kind of hard to tell, but there might be some of that where people have already applied for like a waiver or something like that. I think that some undeveloped parcels either pay residential or pay nothing. Do you know, Andy?
Yeah, we have a few of the large development parcels, ones that are slated for development that are still paying a residential one house on that property, farmland type thing, that's, well, they're zoned for that development since it hasn't happened yet.
Is there a system in place today for a property to apply for a variance? Are we granting any variances? We are. How does that go about if there's not a process?
It's kind of since there was some inequities discovered early on, a little bit of a case-by-case basis. And like Brent said, as we look at the database, we're finding things that were, granted 15 years ago that we didn't really know about or keep track of. So we're trying to limit that, now that we've become aware of it. But there are little things in there where things got moved around or bumped to this category or that to help the situation. But we haven't done that. We haven't done any of those in the last 5 years. But we also haven't went back and corrected any that were done previous to that.
It just kind of as a general observation, it seems to me that we have, and thinking in terms of the discussion at the Board of Supervisors level, we have a system that's pretty clearly out of whack in terms of hitting some classes significantly more than others. And I don't think you get to perfect in one step. And so I think some kind of a process and some kind of a educational discussion, I guess, to try to get closer to equity, because I do think that people can relate to the fact that a big parking lot runs off a whole lot more than a house does. But it seems to me that both moving in a direction that creates a fairer situation in the mind's eye and doing it in a way that phases things might be an avenue to try to get to a point where we have a little bit better correlation between the actual generation of runoff and the cost, if you will, or the charges that go with that. And I do think that some of the large properties are a real asset in terms of runoff, not necessarily a detriment. And it may be that some kind of an element in the schedule for large parcels with virtually no development, not necessarily having, being hit, for example, on a parcel size basis or something like that as things begin to work through. The other thing, and I'm sure the board is going to want to know, and I know you'll be getting there, is the generation of revenues based on various alternatives in relation to the current budget, in relation to the unmet needs of capital, features that we just can't do right now in terms of we borrowed money, we're paying bonds off in the storm drain fund to try to get some of these things done earlier. To me, that's all part of the process of hopefully beginning to bring this into a little more equitable situation. And nobody likes to pay more taxes or higher rates, but, it's like streets or water or sewer or runoff is the same issue. Drainage, when we have issues, it costs money, and we need to try to be making progress rather than just holding our own. At least that's my opinion.
Both Jeff and Bruce earlier mentioned that they were in favor of more of a phase-in approach, and to be honest with you, I recognize that's probably the way we'll end up having to go. I don't think we should point that direction first. I feel like we need to understand what that dollar amount is, and if it's not a huge impact, we move forward with implementing it immediately. If it turns out politically it needs to be phased in over time, then so be it. I would support it at that point, but I don't think I would go there directly. And then the other thing, and I'm not going to say it's the last thing because something else will probably pop into my mind, but something that did occur to me is we have to think about what is the goal of this fee, this rate structure. Is it to simply to raise money for stormwater fund, or is it to perhaps drive policy? And what I mean by that is, are we going to consider, or are you going to think about giving credits for low-impact development measures or pervious pavement? Or is it just simply going to be on square footage of parking area, so to speak? If a larger development comes in and says, I want to be responsible with regards to design and how I manage my stormwater, and it's not going to leave the site, are we going to give them credits for that? Are we going to allow credits for that? And if the answer is no, then we've kind of set a precedent for ourselves that we're not interested in that type of sustainable design for the future. So I think it's just something to be considerate of.
It's a great comment, and a lot of communities do have programs like that, rebates for, on-site detention and low-impact development and things like that. So we could look at look into a little more detail on that, bring that back to kind of present what that would look like if you'd like.
Well, to be honest, it's probably not in your purview. It's probably more of a policy level exercise, right? What does the Board of Supervisors, what do they want to drive out of this? Are we looking simply to preserve a rate structure or maybe shape public opinions?
A little bit of background on that. We so about 2.5 years ago, we went through this process both with this group and the Board of Supervisors, and we had it was in-house. We didn't use a consultant, and we had come up with a rough number of the utility needing approximately $4 million a year, which is double where it's at now. So we had the facts and figures to support that. And so what we presented was just using our current methodology and just raising those rates over a period of, I think, 3 years, a phase in over 3 years to get to that $4 million number that the utility was in need of. That was turned down, not so much based on the need of the money in the fund, but they wanted us to go back and look at the methodology and make sure that it was fair in how we were assessing those fees. And part of that discussion was, if a business is willing to do low impact development, impervious pavement, whatever, that they should be allowed to pay less, that's something that we should consider. So that's all kind of where this is marching forward to. And I think we'll get there. And your point, Bruce, is not missed, that we were looking at these numbers here, but that's the numbers of generating the revenue today. Ultimately we're here because we want to fix this methodology, but we also need to establish the fund for something sustainable into the future. So, one thought I had just while I was sitting here listening that I hadn't even brought up, but, in terms of phasing it in, if the residential's, they're paying a little too much now, but rather than cut that rate, keep the residential rate as it is now, don't go backwards in that, keep that where it is now, and then the increases there would be relatively minimal compared to the increases that are going to hit the commercial, more open areas over time. So that might be one way to kind of soften it and get there, but not, instead of reducing the residence bill right off the bat, don't lower it, keep it where it is now, and maybe don't raise it, or over time slightly. So that's one thing we could look at. I really think the number one goal for today is, so next steps are to take this to a public meeting, just to invite the public to come, although they were all invited today, but to get feedback from the public, and then ultimately we would come back again to this committee and ask for a recommendation of the analysis to the Board of Supervisors. So really today are these 3 ideas the ones we should be pursuing with the tweaks that you have mentioned? Should we be putting more analysis into these 3 ideas, floating it out to the public, and then ultimately bringing it back here with more formal data? That's kind of what we need to reach today.
First of all, I think Mike's comment is really good. Excuse me. I would hope that we could provide a strong incentive for low-impact development, for, properties to do what they can to reduce runoff and to maintain their site, because generally speaking, that has the effect of, engaging a little bit more the property owner in the process of trying to monitor or control the runoff. I think with what we saw today, I think Mike's comments are accurate in my mind. The bell curve approach is a way to look at it, and I think, Brent, it's a reasonable way to look at it, but I think it's harder to explain and it's harder to defend. And to me, the explanation of the perfect world would be runoff based on impervious area for everybody. That's not practical. The imperfect world that we're in is substantially different than that, and marrying those is some kind of a process to get, there potentially in steps, although, as Mike says, maybe the initial one alternative is to get there at once with the idea that we then, and maybe that's for talking purposes, that's a $2 million budget, with the idea that that budget needs to increase 5% a year for 5 years on an across-the-board kind of basis. I don't know. That could be a possibility that we didn't have here today, but might be, in my mind, a little more easily explained and a little bit potentially more palatable from the perspective, particularly of the larger folks. They're going to argue that they generate a lot of taxes, they generate a lot of revenues, and they do. And so maybe some less than perfectly proportional approach makes a lot of sense, but I think the bell curve to me is a little harder to justify, but it's a practical way of segmenting it and coming forward. I do also think that the process needs to recognize that there are going to be inequities out there, and the ability of the city staff to make adjustments based on legitimate technical grounds should be recognized, so that it becomes just an internal process and not, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go to the board to get a variance type of thing.
Well, at the risk of adding more words, I think Bruce kind of hit all my points spot on. I agree, the bell curve is not, I don't think I would move forward. My opinion, I would not move forward with that. I think it's based more on, it should be based more on actual impact to the system. And it's also not reasonable to assume it's going to be straight down the line of exactly what you generate. It's going to be based on exactly what you pay. That's not a reasonable approach either. So it's some sort of hybrid.
So generally, I like the direction you're going with all three studies. I agree the bell curve to me isn't all that great, but for public comment, might want to keep it in there just to see how the public reacts to it. But yeah, I would agree. I think the other method where we're talking about impervious and doing that calculation to make it as equitable as possible, in my mind, fits well.
Okay. Can we go to the slide that has I guess it would be the second method? I just maybe get a little feedback on that I keep going back. Okay, let's go forward a little bit more to here. So is something like this, there's the straight impervious area method, which would, again, it'd result like in the school district paying $1,300 a month for that school property, versus something like this that would kind of combine people into groups that would, again, most of those people on the very large, that 160 is about 4 times what they're currently paying. So it's a bite. And the people on the small end are actually getting a cut, which leans towards more equity. Is this kind of keeping in what you're thinking in terms of phasing in, or are you talking about ultimately getting to a complete impervious area type rate?
I think this is something that we could probably work with, for sure. It's kind of a compromise, and it makes it a little bit more manageable. So I think this should stay within, your purview and potentially get some customer or public impact comments on it and see where we go with that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the idea that you're going to get to perfect, proportionality over time just isn't practical. And frankly, I think the other arguments that a lot of large generators have, taxes, employment, those kinds of things, are valid. And I think we have to give the board the ability to recognize some of those benefits that, a car dealership, for example, brings to Carson City. At the same time, the reality is they generate a lot of runoff, and so moving into something more like this, I think makes some sense to me. I do think you have to recognize that in the long term, I don't think it makes sense to lower any rates for residential. I think you have to have the residential base. That's by far the largest number of contributors in terms of the number of ratepayers that are contributing to the revenue side. But I do think, and I think a gradual increase on that end is reasonably understandable from their perspective. So I guess to answer your question, I think this moves closer, Brent, to that kind of an approach, and at the same time explains to the large generators as well as the board, we're bringing us into a little bit more of a compatibility here without, being drastic or without being, turning somebody like the school district, who is probably the extreme example, into a very difficult adjustment.
Brent asked the question on phased approach. I took that from you guys to mean whatever the preferred alternative is to phasing that in over time. And I heard you maybe ask or Bruce, you answer a different question. Is that this phasing in to get us more toward that equitable solution? Is that the first step in the phase?
Well, I guess the answer is yes, and also the phasing, I think, becomes the basis to begin to get to a more substantial budget to work with. So I really see it in two elements in that regard.
I appreciate that. I think you've got, the first step is modifying the structure, which would be doing something like this, and then going from a $2 million budget to a $4 million budget, or whatever it is, over a period of time, because that'll, have an impact as well.
Do we know what % of the total stormwater revenue comes from the residential rate group?
Actually, I do. It looks like about 58%. And the next highest would be commercial at 27%, and then the others are very small. Multifamily, only 6%, manufacturing 7%, and public 3%. So, yeah, 60% residential.
All right, if there's no other comments, there's no action to be taken. So we will move on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. So that moves us on to item 2B, which is presentation and discussion of manager's report on personnel, projects, and planning. Darren, you're listed.
Yeah, I'll start. Again, Andy Hummel, wastewater utility manager for the record. For the wastewater side, I was going to start kind of on staff updates. We hired a new mechanic, just started last week. A younger guy from Elko, has been in the mining industry for 14, 15 years, so brings some great experience and jumping right in already and helping us out, which is good because another one of our mechanics decided to leave us on the first and go back into business for himself. So we're back on advertising for that position. Should be able to close that in about a week and get somebody else going. One of our operators that we hired earlier this spring got an opportunity up at Round Hill GID. So he, after 3 months, left us to go run that system. It was quite a promotion for him, so we wish him well. But that replacement has been advertising for about 3 weeks now. We've actually gotten 81 applicants on that one, so we should start interviewing next week on that. So, and then in the new budget, we had asked for and received a new environmental control officer. We brought over one of our construction management people, Jen Churchward. She was basically behind the scenes doing a lot of the payroll management, that type of stuff. So she started on July 22nd, and we're happy to have her. We don't have any retirements currently announced on the wastewater side, but watching that, no summer coming. So just kind of trying to get staff ready for when that happens, make sure people are getting the training, that kind of stuff. Operationally, plant's been our fun one the last month or so. For July, our fecal limits, we exceeded them slightly. It's always an issue when it gets hot. The chlorine just doesn't work as well when it's hot, and our permit limit is 2.2 per basically 1,000 milliliters. Our average was 2.9, so slightly above. We had a max, where our max permit limit is 23 vehicle call form units. The max that we recorded was 12, so we were well within that. One reading, we were looking good for the month. It was higher the first half of the month until we got ahead of it, and then it was actually with the construction that's going on out there, as we took one of the clarifiers off, and just that last little layer at the bottom of it got pumped to the wrong spot for about 15 minutes, and it just happened to be about a half hour before the chemist grabbed the sample, and yeah, just kind of a perfect storm. But so that's been reported, and we're already back to under 2 a week later. So, and then last week we had a effluent main leak out on Highway 50 in Sunrise. Reported Wednesday. That's basically that line there. There was a repair done, we think about 15 years ago. It's our mechanic that's been there the longest. He wasn't involved with that repair, doesn't remember it, so it's before his time. But it was basically, that line is asbestos cement pipe, and the coupling bands are just a band that the pipe slides into, and we've had several of those break over the years, and that was what had happened there, and they just put basically a repair clamp on it to fix it, which those tend to be a problem after a while. So that's exactly what had happened here, was that just started leaking and finally leaked enough to show up. So they were able to get that fixed relatively quickly. That's the line that feeds Eagle Valley Golf Course, and had them back by Friday afternoon getting water. So,
Pardon a silly question, because I know we sprinkle it on the golf course.
Yeah.
But when you have a leak like that, is there special reporting that needs to happen because it's a
yeah,
natural
that
line?
does get reported to the state. The main concern would be that water getting to the river because of the chlorination. It made it under the highway. It was on the north side of the highway. Made it underneath and maybe 100 yards south, and it had soaked into the ground. So nice sandy soil helped us. And then late July, we had a sanitary sewer overflow at Anderson Ranch on the line that cuts through the ranch there. Had received a odor complaint. The guys went out and looked, and sure enough, it was basically grease and such in the line that it was kind of a soft plug, just slowly had backed up to where it started coming out a little. They had that cleared within 3 or 4 hours once we saw it. And spent a few days out there just running that line, cameraing it to make sure nothing was actually wrong. It's good PVC line, just had a problem, which sometimes happens. But as far as construction, the wharf work, other than that one little issue with the clarifier, is going really well. They're about to start up the biofilter, the odor scrubber. We had some training on that yesterday, kind of what the mechanics need to watch out for, that kind of stuff. The rehab of the 3 clarifiers they're working on are ahead of schedule. They're doing really well on that. So we should be, the second one they've rehabbed, our one primary clarifier that they're working on, we're looking at starting that one back up next week, putting clean water in it to make sure there's no weird leaks or any problems, make it easier to fix before they put the real water to it. Empire Lift Station, that rehab should begin in a couple of weeks on the 26th. They've actually done some work. The property that's adjacent to, we had to move the fence. They were able to, that property was for sale, so they were able to do that. We had them do that earlier while it was on the market so that it wouldn't impact tenants in there. And then the reuse master plan, the RFQs for that are actually due today. So we'll be probably next meeting a little update on that and the progress there. So as far as my stuff, that's where we're at.
Thank you, Andy.
All right, well, Eddie Collier for the record, Water Utility Manager. I'll be starting off with some staff updates on the water side. We've, as you know, we've lost a couple people to retirements. Rip Palmer, our water operations supervisor, retired, as well as our distribution foreman. Both had been here over 20 years, 20 plus. So it was a big hit, but we've been promoting from within to fulfill those roles. The water operations supervisor is still unfilled as of right now. We have a BOS item tomorrow to elevate the grade on that job description to a professional engineer status. So that's going to the BOS tomorrow, and we'll then go out and look for people from that board direction once we get that. But we've so on those internal promotions, Mike Tiki went from water distribution tech to water distribution foreman. He took over Nick Brown's job. He's doing a great job. Nate Richardson went from a tech 2 in distribution to a senior tech. And Ryan Argist took over from a water meter tech, and he moved into water distribution. So again, just promoting within, it opens up another job and then another job, another job. So we're slowly gaining back from all these retirements, which is good, and keeping a lot of good qualified people. So we're going out for the water meter tech position that Ryan vacated probably tomorrow, or announce that soon. So hopefully by then we'll be fully staffed. Moving on to projects. So 2019 CIP, right now we are currently re-drilling well 3. You've probably seen it out on Winnie Lane, big drill rig out there. It's going very well. It's looking promising for a good production well. I don't want to jinx us yet, so I won't say any numbers, but we're starting the pump test here soon, probably this end of this week or next week. The well's being developed right now, but the drilling went perfectly, so that's looking very promising. East-West pipeline, as you know, is going on right now, going up Washington. It's been going well. We're up by West Sunset Street right now, and taking a 24-inch main and making it fit through all the other utilities. We've hit the old state main that came from Marlette, comes down that street, so we've run into that, portions of that. We also are keeping everybody in water throughout this project. So, if we have to lower a water main, we've been following the regulations on how to shut off people and turn them back on and everything. So it's been a big juggling act, but the contractor's working really well with us, and our water guys are out there all the time, making sure that everyone stays in water for the duration of that project. But once they get past Washington, it'll be, easy digging up to Quill and connect in at the base of the Quill tank. So that project's moving along well right now. On the Marlette side, I know I presented on that last time. We're working in coordination with the Marlette team up there. Communication's been better. We're taking East Slope system. I talked about the different sources up there. The East Slope system's been pumping a lot of the majority of the water that we're taking. So we're actually being able to treat it all right now. We are recharging down VC Canyon to keep that recharge program topped off, so to speak. So we have a side stream going there, but everything else we've been able to treat at Quill due to the large volume of spring water diluting the lake water. They turned on the Marlette pumps briefly, but I think they had some issues, so they're not on as of today. But it will get turned on here soon so they can give us all the flow based on our new agreement. So, and on that same note, been working heavily on a new way to take that water into our system. Been working on a water right transfer from our Quill treatment plant down to our river wells. And it's simply what river or creek water we can't take into Quill, we have to measure it, and whatever makes it to the river would be a credit into those wells. So that's been going on. We've gotten a preliminary approval from the water master, the federal water master who regulates the Carson River, and we've met with the state twice, the state engineer's office twice, and they're on board with our plan, and we are moving forward with investigating metering technology that we have to add per the recommendations from the water master and the state. So I'm working on that project right now to install some metering within the storm drain further down in the system to make sure that we can track how much those creeks are actually contributing to the river. So that's going on, and we're working on the change applications for temporary change applications so that we can get this monthly credit going forward. So whether we can treat the Marlette and creek water or not, I still want to be able to take it into the system, because there are ways to do it. So that's been a big project as of yet. Moving on to the 2020, looking forward in the 2020, we have a Prison Hill booster pump station on track. That's 90% plans as of right now. We're looking at spring of 2020 to implement that project to go to construction. And that's in the budget. And then another portion of the money for the next CIP is water line replacements. We have over $1 million, so we've been working on those, coordinating those projects for next season, as well as a tank rehab that we discussed, I think, last time, Gonai Canyon tank rehab. That one's given us some operational issues on taking that tank down and still meeting fire flow. So we might have to rent another bladder or tank to provide fire flow. So we've been working on that side so that we can actually rehab the tank, since it's a solitary tank. We have no redundancy there. That wraps up the project portion. Operationally, we've had some interesting issues, the normal things, but we had a fire pump go down at the Shadow Hills zone, and those are along Edmonds, the two zones between that straddle Prison Hill tank on Kuntz. So it's Desert Mountain and Shadow Hills. They are both fed by separate booster pump stations that are both underground. And that's what will be, those two will be replaced by the Prison Hill booster pump station next year. But in the interim, we're working on some old technology, old fire pumps. We had Shadow Hills fire pump go down when we tested it. It blew seals and the motor burned up. So we had to coordinate with the fire department. We had water tenders out there. We got a new pump and replaced it within a few days. So it was a coordinated effort, and the production guys did a great job getting a new pump in. So it lended more to the reason why we need that Prison Hill booster pump station and have one above ground, because you can imagine dropping a pump down basically a manhole lid and then weaving it through an underground vault and installing it. It's a pretty difficult task to get a new pump in there and out. So luckily, I don't think they've had to do that, but we found out how hard it was. So that was an interesting situation, but we learned more about our system and everything and how we run it. So it was good. And that concludes my presentation on the water side.
Thank you, Eddie. And I want to just go back and talk about the staffing that you guys mentioned earlier. Promoting from within, it's always the best thing to do from a staff morale standpoint, preserving that institutional knowledge. And please pass congratulations on to those folks that received promotion from us.
Will do.
With that, I think we're on to item number 3, which is future agenda items. Brent earlier in his presentation talked about the next meeting. There was going to be another presentation in that next meeting I have showing as September 24th, followed by a meeting on November 18th. Does that meet with your guys' schedule?
So we talked a little bit about this, Mr. Chair, and we are not going to be ready September 24th to come back with further analysis what we did today, but we also want to have that public meeting before we come back to this body. So I would be of a mind to cancel that 9/24 meeting, and then the next meeting after that is scheduled for November 18th. But perhaps we would be ready to meet in October rather than wait till November. So we can either just wait and go to November, or if we want to move this along, we could reschedule the 9/24 meeting to October, and I'm open for.
I'm not opposed either way. I'll bring it back to the committee for your preference. I think if you have momentum and we need to adjust a meeting date to meet a schedule, then I don't particularly have a concern with that.
No, I'd be happy to meet in October to keep things moving if that's what would help.
Well, why don't we put on the record now that we're canceling the 9/24 meeting, and then we'll know in the next maybe 3 weeks or so whether we are ready to schedule a meeting in October, or if we'll just plan on the November meeting to bring this back. We also will be hearing at that meeting for agenda items. We will have finance come and present the final fiscal 19 budget. That will all be finalized. What you saw before was just draft estimates. So we would be hearing that as well whenever we have the next meeting. In terms of other agenda items, I didn't have anything on my list here to bring or to talk about, but if there's something that you would like, let's.
Committee have anything you'd like to add for the next one?
Well, are we assuming the next one would be water, sewer, and storm drainage then, on the rate side? That would be October?
We'd be ready by September for water and sewer, but also October. We'll be ready, I think. We have to work with you on some of that.
Yeah. Sounds like it that, yeah, all 3 of them could come to that whenever that next meeting is. And then if we're ready to make recommendations to the Board of Supervisors from there, that's kind of where we had progression as to where this would go. So it would follow up from there to go. And if we get direction here that we need to change something and then come back, we can do that like in November, say, and then go to the board. So we would be pretty open.
Okay. Between water, sewer, and storm drain rate structure, hopefully we have some public present, and then adding to the budget, we may end up with a long meeting, so we may want to split it up or determine agenda items as we get closer. So if nothing else to add, Jeff, you didn't have anything to add, then we'll close future agenda items, and that leaves us with our final public comment, and seeing none. Look for a possible action to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved. We're adjourned. Thank you.